Hey there, good evening. Nice to see you. It's time for the Bronx Buzz. This is Bronx Net's program where we talk to reporters, writers, editors, journalists, people who write op-ed pieces, which is a foreshadowing of our second segment today. But we're going to start out with a foremost journalist, and he's actually just written an incredibly great piece about one part of the Bronx. And so it's our longtime friend and associate, deputy editor of City Limits, David Brand. Hi, Dave.
Hey, Gary.
Nice to have you with us.
Thanks.
Let's just get started. Which actually came out today, the day that we're recording this program. This story about the Just Home project,
Mhm.
and you took a look at it at the point of view that the formerly incarcerated who need care need to have a place to go, and you pointed up the kind of opposition that we're seeing there from the community. How do you see this from your perspective after you did all that research and interviewing, et cetera? What do you think? I'm going to tell you editorially, for me, I think it's hard to deny this project. I think we need it, but you can say whatever you want.
Well, as a member of the community, Roxanne Delgado, who kind of makes that same point, and I talked with her in the story, and she's been pretty vocal, and she also did an op-ed for us at City Limits saying like it's kind of hypocritical to oppose this project because it's supportive housing for people who are leaving jails, either awaiting trial or they have served their sentence, they've paid their debt to society and now need a place to stay. And so, how can people both oppose shelters in the area as well as the solution to homelessness? And that's this supportive housing project. So, it's 70 units, 50 of them would be reserved for formerly incarcerated individuals, another 20 would be for low income community members. It's fully contained on the grounds of Jacoby Hospital, it's in a vacant staff residence. And yet the opposition is fierce, and that's what a lot of the story focus on. Like you walk around Indian Village neighborhood, pretty much every yard has a sign saying "Not here, not now, not ever," opposing the project. There's a lot of fear, a lot of discrimination, a lot of, I think, misinformation about what this
I was
project is.
that's where I was going to go about partially misinformation. And to me, that's part of which is why I really appreciated the work that you did, um, because the one two things I will say. Number one, what happens to those people if you don't do this?
Mhm.
And then it did come out. Ms. Delgado mentioned it in your article. It did come out very clearly that if you don't do this, you can't be complaining about people sleeping in the street or other issues and going into an emergency room where people don't know what else to do, so they're hurt or they're sick. And here's a chance to do it within a confined, quote unquote, confined place. Do you have the sense that because one of the things that's out there is they're going to be wandering in our neighborhood?
Mhm.
I have this sense, as opposed to maybe some other projects, it's in the Jacoby Medical Center, area. So is there any reality to that? Or I mean, I don't want to just dismiss their claims, but I'm trying to find the logic in it personally.
I guess I mean it's possible. I guess there's a wall and a fence that separate the campus from the neighborhood of Indian Village, and then the only way out, I guess, would be to go onto Pelham Parkway. Um, but people are concerned. This is kind of like supercharging the normal concerns people often have about new development, especially new low income housing development, because of uh, people coming in are formerly incarcerated, and so that leads immediately to opponents saying, "Would you want murderers in your neighborhood? Would you
That
want
that's
rapists in your
right.
neighborhood?" But that's kind of taking the very worst case scenario and applying a broad brush to
Right.
people who will be living
It
there. So,
there is a lot of fear out there. As far as when it gets approved, whether it gets approved, you didn't get a quote from Councilmember Velasquez. She is traveling, and that's understandable. This is the time of year that she's going to do that. But there were many people in the community upset because after saying she opposed the Bruckner development, she ultimately signed off on the deal.
mhm,
So I guess it remains to be seen. At the moment, she's scheduled to come on Bronx Talk right after the first of the year. Maybe
nice.
we'll have some answers,
Yeah,
but it's also possible schedules change. I mean, I don't
yeah.
want to promise anything. I want to add on to the dialogue here today. you're writing about Mayor Adams ordering the removal of people who are deemed mentally ill. I think there's, in part, a relationship between these. The idea is the mayor has looked at homeless people who are mentally ill, some of them committing crimes. I mean, this is not a good thing to have people who are not well and maybe not safe wandering our streets. And now his idea is we're simply going to take them off the streets. We're going to involuntarily put them in hospitals or other places. This is a has been a challenging concept
Mhm.
for the mayor. What do you make of it? Is it possible to do this and make it work?
I think the issue is so deep that a lot of the criticism that this plan is facing is that it really only scratches the surface of moving people out of public spaces temporarily and taking them to hospitals, when
Mm,
a lot of people have pointed out that one of the main issues is that hospitals will quickly discharge people or won't admit people at all, even if they
yeah.
are.
You got a
uh,
broken leg and you think you're going to stay for a couple of days.
yeah,
Forget that.
yeah.
Let alone a much less easy to diagnose situation.
Exactly. And so then what happens? Someone is taken to the hospital. Maybe they are admitted for 72 hours, discharged. Maybe they're
Yeah,
not admitted at all. They're discharged immediately. What happens? Right back on the streets, right back on the subway. So it's a more complex issue that demands more comprehensive response when it comes to better shelter services, ultimately more housing, more supportive housing. Like you mentioned, the connection between these two articles is the supportive housing connection. And so right now, New York City has about
that's right.
2,600 vacant supportive housing apartments that take a long time to fill. And for whatever reason, because of bureaucratic obstacles, because nonprofits can kind of pick and choose who they want to house in those sites, takes a long time. And on many instances, the people most in need are not getting the housing that they
That's
need.
right. You interviewed Stephen Banks, who has a long history in serving the homeless community in this city, and he, I think, correctly said, "Well, this is one thing, but the process." And David, you deal with this every day, of supportive housing, proper housing, affordable housing, and it has to have some kind of service component. What if
Mhm.
you have somebody who's kind of acting out but is not specifically dangerous, and you're getting the police involved? It starts
Yeah,
to.
yeah,
Yeah, I'll just throw this out. The mayor was a police officer, and when he looks at solutions, this is how he sees the world. I mean,
yeah.
that's what they did when they moved the homeless. How did that homeless encampment thing work out? Where they took apart homeless encampments. I know they got accused of taking people's property,
Mhm.
but did they find that people ended up in shelters or in better situations?
In a small number of cases, people did agree to enter shelter, but I think in most cases, people didn't, and so becomes just moving people along to the next place and the next place. And there was some data that recently came out. Organization Safety Net Project got it through Freedom of Information Law, shared it with Gothamist for a story, and I think one site was targeted like 90 times this year, just
Wow.
continuing, continuing, continuing to.
And you know what that is also, again, for me, even editorial, it's difficult for me to hear, maybe for a lot of people to hear. It makes the people who have very difficult lives more difficult. So they trying to get themselves even situated, and I'm not saying it's acceptable or not acceptable, but this is what they've had to do. They get situated in a little encampment by the East Side drivers, by the FDR Drive, and all of a sudden that's moved out. Then they got to go find another highway that they're going to live under because the shelter system is not working. Along with that, I mean, this just goes on and on. You wrote a story about empty rent stabilized units in New York City decreasing this year, but the warehousing debate uh, rages. Let's talk a little bit about that before we run out of time. The number of empty apartments matches the vacancy rate prior to the landmark 2019 tenant protections. Where are we at? To me, the first part of that sounded like it was good news, you know?
Yeah, that's why this is such a complicated issue because
That's
if
exactly right.
you again, I know,
I'm
it's like we
trying.
can't
I'm
talk.
working on it, Dave.
Can we just have some easy solutions here, Gary? This is like too everything's so complex. But yeah, so a few weeks ago, the new site, The City, reported on the 2021 vacancy report, rent stabilized apartment vacancy report, which was based on 2020 data. And it showed that the number of vacant apartments, rent stabilized apartments, had really spiked to around 61,000. And then New York City Housing Agency said, actually, it's closer to 90,000. So that
Wow.
got people really upset. Like,
Yeah.
we have a housing crisis. How can we possibly have all these
Empty
vacancies?
about.
The more recent data for April of 2022 shows that the rate of vacancies has decreased to pre-pandemic and even pre-2019 levels, showing that that was probably an anomaly based on wealthier people from Manhattan moving out, as we all saw during the
Right.
pandemic, and they live in buildings that are rent stabilized. The rents are very high because the buildings receive the 421A tax subsidy. So, all that's to say is that data was used for many different political
Just to
needs.
be clear, so we have some of that vacancy is gone, but those it almost revealed the fact that some of these rent stabilized apartments were not being used for people who really needed it, but people who did have a little bit of excess and
Yeah,
had the wherewithal during the
yeah,
pandemic to leave the city.
yeah, yeah.
Um, so that's where we're at, and then what then becomes the status of those apartments? Are they being transferred to people who need it to help ease the housing crunch, or are we in in the situation where basically replacing one frankly well-to-do person with another?
Yeah. Well, that's why this is such a hot issue because
Yes.
those 421A apartments might have been built 4 years ago and maybe have a rent of $10,000, but they're considered rent stabilized. But yet they kind of get, if you just look at bulk data, they get grouped into the more traditional rent stabilized apartments, which are pre 1974 buildings. Many cases, very low rents, very low income people living in them, and so when you look at the bulk data, there's not much distinction,
Right.
and yet that bulk data gets used by landlord groups saying, "See, we
See,
want
yep.
we
Oh man.
we want to bring these apartments back online, but we
Right.
can't because we can't afford it. We need to change the
Right.
rent
Right.
laws."
Right.
And then you have renter groups saying how horrible this is, that we're in a housing shortage and you're withholding apartments from us.
Got it.
You need to be
Dave,
penalized. So
Dave, we got to move on. I can't tell you how important your work is to all of us in the
thank
Bronx
you,
and in
Gary.
the city of New York. It's thorough, it's well researched. We need you. Thank you for everything you do. Deputy editor of City Limits. Check out citylimits.org and make sure you read David Brand and all the other great writers that work there. Thanks so much.
Thanks a lot, Gary. It's great.
Okay, we will take a short break, and then the head of a national not for profit that's dealing with homeless students in our public schools. So we'll be right back.